Welcome to the AtlantECO podcast, where we talk about the science behind the AtlantECO project, the Atlantic Ocean, and the human adventures experienced along the way. Here, we have conversations with guests from around the world who work together so that we can better understand, manage, and protect the ocean. So let's embark on the journey of AtlantECO and discover the world that lies above and beneath the surface of the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. Welcome back to the AtlantECO podcast, and today we're discussing one of AtlantECO's case studies which aims to apply the knowledge and the resources we're developing in the project into existing challenges and needs that we have identified. Our guest today, Natasha Karenyi, tells us about the considerations that need to be taken into account when developing and implementing environmental regulations of coastal areas in the context of shallow sea diamond mining. So a mouthful, but we'll get into the subject. Let's first welcome our guest. So Natasha, hi, and welcome to the podcast. It is a pleasure to have this discussion with you today.
Hi, Eloise. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very excited to be here.
Before we get into the depth of today's topic, I'd like to get to know a little bit more about you. So could you tell us about where your connection with and your interest in the ocean started and how it has evolved over the years to bring you where you are now and doing what you do today?
So my journey has really, I think, been one of curiosity. I didn't have much interaction with the ocean when I was young, and really only in high school, when in high school biology, I learned about the different organisms, the different animals you find in the marine system. And that just piqued my curiosity. I also loved swimming. So I thought, well, possibly a career option is marine biology. And then I interviewed a marine biologist at the University of Cape Town about what a career in marine biology is and what it entails and where I could go with it. And I was completely hooked after that. And so from that, I studied at UCT and I explored a number of different fields in marine biology, but settled on benthic ecology, which is what I'm doing now. And I did my PhD at the Nelson Mandela University. And then following that, I started as a lecturer at UCT.
UCT, we should say, is the University of Cape Town. That's where you are in South Africa.
That's right.
So as mentioned at the beginning, today we want to touch upon one of the case studies in our project, so in AtlantECO, where we're trying to support policymaking in understanding consequences of ocean mining so that they can develop maybe some policies for the environment. So first of all, can you tell us about what the challenges are and also the needs that exist?
Sure. So with AtlantECO, we'll be working in both Namibia and South Africa. So that's in the Benguela Large Marine Ecosystem. But these countries have quite different policy frameworks, data limitations, understandings of their systems, and political structures. So in both countries, there's a keen interest in diamond and phosphate mining, as well as petroleum extraction. So though we're dealing with similar challenges, they're also very specific challenges and needs within each of those countries. Within Namibia, we engaged with the Namibian Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, as well as Marine Namibia as stakeholders. And for the Namibian Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, they were really interested in assistance with baseline benthic information to expand their monitoring programs, which could then inform policy. Whereas Marine Namibia was very interested in the context of the benthic habitats that they already are mining. So they have mining licenses for specific areas, and they want to understand how those ecosystems in those areas are different from other ecosystems in Namibia. And then within the South African context, we initially engaged with the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, who are now called DMR, so Department of Mineral Resources. And in South Africa, we have a very long history of terrestrial mining, and the policy is really geared towards that type of mining. But what they needed assistance with was the development of guidelines for environmental management of ocean mining specifically. So how is that different from terrestrial mining, essentially? And so this is where this whole process started, and the case study has evolved from that.
And in AtlantECO, how are we helping to address these challenges and the needs?
So again, I'm going to speak about Namibia versus South Africa,
Yeah.
since we're in these different spaces. So I have a PhD student, Damonongenda Matthias, or Mona for short, and she will be working on that contextualization of the mining areas. So she will look at benthic ecosystems and try to provide a baseline against which mining and currently mined areas can be compared. So within Namibia, there is an ecosystem classification that is available. It was done for the entire Benguela, but it was based only on topography, bathymetry, and I think it was temperature in that space. And so it's not very cohesive, and it doesn't have any biological information associated with it. So what Damona is hoping to do is to use specifically macrofauna as the basis for her ecosystem classification, but she will also include some understanding of the benthic pelagic coupling. And so she will include some of the microbiome in that process as well. So that will help both the Namibian Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, as well as DebMarine Namibia. But then that information will also support marine spatial planning within the Namibian context. So the information that we're producing and the discussions that we're having will certainly feed into policy and environmental management in Namibia. Then on the South African side, we were really approached by the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, which is now Mineral Resources. And they were just trying to understand what was different about ocean mining and what should they then incorporate into their environmental impact assessment framework. Initially, because this was done mainly during COVID, we had a look at the documents that were available, some of the case studies that were available, and we considered things like direct impacts, indirect impacts of mining, sediment movement modeling, and some stakeholder engagements that already occurred. So this was all based on existing information. And then try to make recommendations based on those, as well as a proposal for future work. However, since we've had a bit of a reshuffle politically again, we haven't really made any progress towards that proposed future work. So
the idea is really to help them understand how the activities will have an impact, not only maybe on the physical properties of the ocean, but also the life that evolves around in those areas. And I guess those people making those policies and taking those decisions, and also those mining, those environments really need to understand the impact on the different resources that are in the ocean. And yeah, if I understand correctly, whatever we're doing, we're providing them with that kind of information and trying to model maybe the different impacts.
Yeah, so in this sense, we were actually trying to produce hopefully a tool that they could use. But in order to do so, we require a lot more information, and it's not information that's easily accessible to us. So it would have to essentially be provided by either the companies or one of these governmental organizations. We're still hoping to move forward with that at some point, but it's not something we can do by ourselves. The other aspect is obviously the social aspect around mining and around the stakeholder engagement. And in South Africa, our communities also have a very deep connection with the ocean. And so including the social and economic information into these EIA processes will be very important in future.
So you told us about the challenges, about how we're trying to contribute. So now we are about 3 years into the project and 2 years left into AtlantECO. Where are we now with the case study, and what will still happen in the couple of years that are about to take place, and also, I guess, beyond that point?
So from those kind of reports that we produced for the Department of Marine Resources and Energy, a couple of things kind of jumped out at us that fits really well with the AtlantECO processes. So the one aspect is that they didn't really consider the ocean as a three-dimensional medium. It's a medium that can support particles, whether that's sediment or pollutants or metals, and it can hold that in suspension before it's deposited, right? And also that ocean water moves. So if you are working in the terrestrial system and you put your mining tailings and so on in a specific space, it stays there. Whereas in the ocean, these things move. So it stays in suspension, and then depending on the currents or wave action, these things can move quite large distances, and that needed to be considered. Where do those particles end up? Perhaps in marine protected areas, and we need to be aware of those kinds of things. And then also the direct and indirect impacts of these ecosystems were not very clearly outlined in terms of the EIA process. And then other things like the stakeholder engagement. One of the things that came up was that there are these hidden stakeholders, because when you're offshore, the assumption is you'd only have to deal with the big industries, right? So it would have to be the fisheries industry, other mining companies. And when I say mining, I include petroleum extraction in that, as well as maybe shipping or, any underwater infrastructure that's being built. But there are other stakeholders, community-based stakeholders who have connections to specific spaces, and those people were not being engaged in this process. So that was something that came up, access to information. So even though all these EIA reports were being produced, they were not being housed anywhere. So access to previous information, or being able to then understand impacts over the long term, none of that kind of work has been done, because it's all single company based, and it requires, an expansion in terms of understanding, like a meta-analysis, like what is happening across all the different types of companies or all the different types of mining activities. So what is the actual cumulative impact, for example? And framing it under socio-ecological systems, where you include the societal and economic aspects with the ecological impacts to understand what the holistic overall impact of the mining activity is. So that's all from the South African context. Currently, we haven't started the Namibian work yet. We have all the permits in place, and Mona is doing everything that she can in order to get there, but we have had some technical difficulties with the vessel that we were going to use, and so we're waiting for repairs. And once that's done, then we'll certainly start the work in Namibia, which will be beneficial to both Namibian Ministry of Fisheries as well as Dead Marine Namibia.
Yeah. And if you think of everything that you've gathered so far and the information that you have, what kind of recommendations can you make?
So recently we had a science to policy workshop in Cape Town, and it brought together 5 international projects that are currently working in Atlantic, and AtlantECO was one of those projects. And we had a session where we unpacked what each of the project was doing and tried to distill some key findings from that, which we would then share with policymakers on the final day of this workshop. In our sense, the policymakers were mainly South African. We did invite Namibian policymakers, but they were unable to attend. And they were mainly from the biodiversity sector, although all the sectors were invited, but these are the people that were able to attend. In that workshop, we actually distilled a key finding around mining impacts and EIAs. And I'm going to read it, which is just that the indirect and cumulative impacts of mining and petroleum on the ocean and people are now better understood. However, they are not sufficiently considered in environmental impact assessments. And so in this workshop, we also worked with policymakers to try and develop recommendations for future development of the environmental impact assessment process. But in the session, we also kind of had a glimpse into the marine spatial planning process within the South African context as well. And so we have recommendations based on single operations, so a company doing an environmental impact assessment. And one of the recommendations there is that we develop guidelines for including cumulative and indirect impacts in environmental impact assessments for practitioners. Then there was a really strong recommendation for an assessment of the cumulative impact of multiple operations within a sector. So if it's mining, it will be different mining operations within the same space. And what is the cumulative impact of that? And then in terms of multiple operations, so that's where you have various sectors that are are intersecting, such as your fishery sector and your mining sector, for example, within the MSP process. And in South Africa, there's quite a lot of work underway already. And so we were just trying to figure out how we fit into that space. And one of the key things there was that the social aspects and economic aspects are not well included in that MSP process. And so hopefully we'll find a way to improve that in future.
Yeah, and just thinking whilst I listen to you talking, so if you want to bring those different information together, is there a way of framing it in that way that could it be in the same sector or across sectors that they report in the same way, or do they already have like standards that they report to, or can they just choose to assess what they want to assess?
Yeah, so before that was not the case, so they could report as they saw fit. Within our government, there's no hierarchy across the different sectors. So, for example, the biodiversity sector versus the mining sector versus the fishery sector, they don't answer to each other. But within the MSP process, my understanding is that they have to produce similar reports that can then be compared, and then there will be negotiations around spaces that would be allotted to different activities. So that process is quite far down the line already, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I don't think that's going to happen in the next short while. So it will be a couple of years before all those processes are streamlined.
But I mean, in a way, we are contributing to understanding what the challenges are, what the needs are, and making recommendations to say, okay, if we want to do that well, we should do it that way, or we should include that information.
Yes, absolutely. The biodiversity sector particularly is very open to that. The mining sector has been, but as I said, shuffling of cabinets and our political changes always slows down these processes. So perhaps in the next year or so, we'll make some headway again.
Yeah, you have to kind of start again where you started with the previous government.
Exactly.
And then explain the priorities, and maybe somebody else is looking for their ideas and their needs. And so it's not always straightforward, but hopefully, as you said, in the next few months, everything will go back to being smooth and going forward.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that.
Yeah. So, well, thank you today for taking the time to explain to us what it is that you're doing for that case study. And maybe we can come back to you in a couple of years to see how it has progressed and where we're at. So thanks again, Natasha.
Thanks very much, Eloise.
We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and look forward to seeing you next time. You can follow the AtlantECO project on our website on www.atlanteco.eu, and you can also find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. All the links and information on the project and on today's episode is in the show notes. AtlantECO is a project funded under Horizon 2020, a European Union research and innovation programme.